Well, hello. Thank you everyone for coming today, listening to our webinar here, our presentation. I'm Matt. I'm technical advisor at Flow at Energy, and I'm with my colleague Julien, who's our application engineer. For those of you who doesn't know Flow, we're a manufacturer and provider of charging electric vehicle solutions. So we manufacture the hardware, the charging stations, develop the software, do the operations, and maintain the largest network in Canada and part of the US as well. So the goal of this presentation here is just to share with you our experience in deploying charging stations in different buildings, how we do to provide the best charging experience for the EV drivers, but also on the other hand for the building owners, how we can minimize cost and optimize the potential revenue generations and so on. So before we start, I would like to know if any of you has already some experience with electric vehicles. If you can raise your hands if you own an electric vehicle or you know what's a level 2 chargers, what's a DC fast charger. Okay. Okay, cool. So I see we will explain really the fundamentals as well around EV charging. So electric vehicles, they've been around for more than a decade now. Of course, as a new technology, it started slow, lots of early adopters. There was plug-in hybrids, and then full electric vehicles with low range. But we started seeing a lot of pickup starting 2016, 2018 with a really beginning of the exponential. It was not linear sales, really starting exponential. And then, well, something happens, and in 2020 we were unsure where it was going to go. Like, it's kind of stabilized for a bit, but now it's extremely clear that this is going to accelerate. And the events we got like over the past year and a half is actually catalyzing the sales of electric vehicles. Like it's more an issue of production than an issue of demand, because governments are pushing as well for more green initiatives, like pushing the economy back and in a sustainable way. So the current EV drivers really, it's early adopter, but because of the ramp up now, they're not even, we're leaving the early adopters phase, is going more mainstreams, but still, it's still a premium vehicle. It's still for people living more in a city environment with high degrees of education. Generally, their income is higher than gas vehicle owners. So this is kind of for our demographic at the moment. But we're seeing with the new vehicles coming, the price of the vehicles is going lower and lower. The range is also bigger, so you can do road trips and long distance. The charging infrastructure is getting better and faster as well. So this is what we're seeing right now, but it's becoming to change and getting more mainstream. For those of you who hasn't driven an electric vehicle or don't own an electric vehicle, there's something that's really specific to EVs. It's completely different than a gasoline vehicles. Where a gasoline vehicles, you fuel up rapidly, and then you drive until your tank is close to empty, and then you refuel. So once a week, once every 2 weeks, you go to the gas station and do that. With an electric vehicle, well, you have to realize that electricity, if you look around you, electricity is everywhere. So you can charge your vehicle basically everywhere. So the situation is completely different, where you will plug in whenever you can, and you don't need to wait for your battery to be empty to start plugging in your vehicle and charging your vehicle. So you will more do a plug-in every day, charge for your daily needs to get the energy that you need for your day, or in different contexts. So we see charging going not at a similar as a gas station. We'll see charging going at home, at work, at the grocery store, at the workplace, and also on the go when you need to do long distance trip. So that's the distribution basically. At home, it's around 60%. Sometimes we see 70, 80%, depending on your lifestyle. But primarily, you want to charge at home. It's relatively simple because, well, you have to go home. you live at home, so it's really convenient to go home, plug in, and then you charge. It's actually more convenient than the gasoline vehicles where you have to do a detour and then stop for a few minutes to fuel up and then go back home. Here you don't even have to worry about refueling your vehicle because you go home. But we also see the convenience of working at your workplace. Some also don't necessarily have access to a home charger. So if the employer is providing a workplace charger, then you go at your work destination, and you can plug in and you charge for a couple of hours. And then the last piece is over weekends or on vacations or in some different situations when you don't have access to workplace, then you go where we say on the go. So it's retail stores, malls, on highways, and then you have access to charging stations to refuel your vehicle. And your needs are a bit different, of course, because you usually, depending on the time you spend at the venue, you will need faster charging and so on. So that's why Julien will present some of the products that we have that address these needs. On the regulatory side, we see that the infrastructure is getting pushed to be ready. So there's a lot of municipalities in Canada, but also in the States, provinces that are pushing for mandates for electric vehicles charging stations to be more accessible, especially in multi-residential buildings or different parking lots, where there's a mandate when you build a new MURBs or a new parking, you need to have some kind of EV, what we call EV readiness, which means the electrical infrastructure needs to be there, and then you need to be capable of installing charging stations. And of course, there's more of the stick, but then on the other hand, you have the incentives. So it's, the government is also providing fundings and grants to install those charging stations and pay for the extra capital cost and the materials. So one of the use case we see is the multi-residential or the workplace. They use kind of the same technology because if you look at the EV drivers, their behavior, they go in a multi-residential place or a workplace, they would stay for long hours, like typically 4 to 8 for workplace or 8 to 10 for residential. So they have a long time to charge. So they don't need a lot of power on their charging station. They just need access to a plug and electricity. So this is what you can install, but you just need many charging stations because you can have multiple vehicles, and those vehicles will stay on the spot for long hours. So some of the consideration, if you're looking at installing charging stations in multi-residential or workplace, is how can you what's the benefits for the tenants or the employee? Are they interested to have those charging stations? Are they looking at having an EV? Or do you want also to drive more EV adoptions? Because there's always, with the charging infrastructure, the chicken and the eggs, where someone is on the fence to get an electric vehicle, but they don't see charging options, so they're a bit worried. But then if you bring the charging infrastructure there, you will drive the EV adoptions as well, which is a way to create new revenue because you can monetize this and so on. It's also important to look if the building already exists, the existing infrastructure, what's the electrical infrastructure you already have in place, what's the civil work needed to install those charging stations, what needs to be done. So that's the first phase. Then you also have to look at what will be the new cost, operational costs. So In big buildings, you have to pay for the energy, the kilowatt hour, but you also have to pay for the kilowatts. So it's not a simple math of just, oh, I will add charging stations, so it will add this much kilowatts, this much power. Depending on the shape, the electrical curve of your building, you may be able to mitigate those costs in a smart way. So you have to look at the different energy management solutions that comes with the charging stations. The other side, well, I talk more about the multi-residential. There's a workplace. So the workplace, it's very similar, but it's also the opposite. Where multi-residential, you would see EV drivers charging overnight. Where workplace, people will charge during the day. So the electrical consumptions will be quite different, but in a sense, the technology remains the same, and the mitigations are also similar. But it's also a good tool or a good perks for your employees to, if you want to attract new employees, or if the companies wants to have more of a green image, sustainable impact. That's a way to, as I was saying, drive EV adoptions by showing the employee or future EV drivers that they have an options to charge. And then the last use case I was explaining at the beginning of the presentation, the on-the-go. That's more, you don't go there every day like your workplace or your home, but sometimes you go there, or it's on your road trip somewhere. You need to have access to charging stations too, because you need the energy. Like your typical electric vehicles now, they have between 200 and 400 kilometers of range. So if you drive more than that for a day or two, you need to access those on-the-go chargers where you can plug in for typically 30 to an hour. Sometimes it's longer depending on what you're doing, but you need those type of chargers. So if you're planning to look at those on-the-go chargers, then reliability is of course a big thing. You need to make sure that the charging station works. There's because the charger is public, you have to make sure there's some vandalism protections. We've seen many cables being damaged or screen being damaged, and so on. You have the environment, the weather, cold, like snow, ice, the heat, the warm in the summer. And then there's the whole layout, like how are you going to install those charging stations? It's even worse than a gas car, where the gas car you have the tank can be on the left rear left or the rear right. With an electric vehicles, we're seeing the plug being everywhere, like rear left, rear right, in the front left, front right. So if you want to support all types of vehicles, you need to make sure that the charging stations will be in a place that's convenient for any type of vehicles. And you will see that because it's a very high power, those cables can be quite heavy. So there's a lot of consideration there in terms of experience. How can we make it easy for the driver to plug in the vehicles, authenticate as well, to be able to pay for the service, and how you're going to collect the revenues. Here it's so it's the on-the-go, but in retail situations, we found this is a very interesting finding. So because our stations are connected to our cloud platform, we collect data, and we're trying to value all the data that we're getting from our Flow members. So to access a Flow charging stations, you need to become a member. So you need to register. So we have your account, and we can track the different charging stations, where you're doing that, how much energy you're requesting, how long you're staying at the charging stations, and so on. And one interesting findings is that typically in mall, we see that EV drivers, they're staying on average 91% extra at the mall. Maybe because they need to charge their vehicle for a longer period, but it's a very interesting data for the retailer, because they know if they install charging stations, they will have access to a demographic, or they will attract a demographic that will stay longer in the mall and can generate potentially more indirect revenue by buying stuff and so on. So we think it's really important to start looking at EV charging stations in buildings. It's something that can create a competitive advantage. For example, I was on vacation during the summer. I had rented an electric vehicle. I got the blessing of my partner, but I was in charge of finding the charging stations and looking at where we can charge a vehicle. And this really drives some of our decision, or okay, we're going to go to this restaurant, or we're going to this mall because there's a charging stations and we need to charge the vehicle. So it creates some awareness there. And as I was saying, there's some mandates coming. There's some incentives there, but the incentives won't be there forever. Once it's going mainstream, the incentives will go away. So we believe it's kind of a right time to start looking into it and look at how you can also have a green impact of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that actually you could also monetize, by the way. So typically, the first step you need to do is do what we call a site analysis. So you will look at your location, if it already exists, and see how many parking lots there are, what's the status of the building, what's the status of the electrical infrastructure, and so this is more on the building side, but you also need to look at the EV driver side, like what will be the type of vehicle you will charge? Is it for fleet? Is it your own vehicles? Then if it's your own vehicles, you know the energy requirement, the distance the vehicles will travel per day. So you can kind of estimate what will be the future energy requirement. And you can do this also for public chargers and try to estimate what will be your need in terms of power and energy. And then once you've done that, you can select what type of charging station you need. So there's slow chargers that we call level 2. That's about 7 kilowatts. You will charge an EV from 0 to 80% in about, depending on the battery, like 4 to 10 hours. And then you have the fast charger that will charge a vehicle in about 30 minutes to 50 minutes, depending on the battery and the power of the charger, from 0 to 80%. So depending on your assessments, your site analysis, you can determine what's your need in terms of charging infrastructure. And now I will let Julien explain more of the solutions we have.
Perfect. Well, thanks a lot, Matt. So yes, I think in terms of explaining to you the different steps to deploy charging station, well, the most obvious part of it is the hardware. So as you can see, the first question you need to ask, and based on the insight that Matt just provided, is which charging station is the right one for my use case. So at Flow, we can provide some of the supports to help you navigate through the different charging stations we offer, and based on what's your needs and what you're trying to achieve. But obviously the charging station hardware itself is not, it's just the tip of the iceberg. So obviously if you're looking at, for example, the public location, to attract the drivers, they need to access the public station through the app. They need to look at their map to see whether or not there's a charging station there, whether or not there's already a driver's parked there with a transfer of energy. Will they be able to charge once they come? So there's all this ecosystem around the additional services you need to provide to the EV drivers for them to have the best charging experience. So this is also something we can support, and providing those drivers the e-mobility services that I've just mentioned. Another aspect of it being the billing option. So for example, if you're a site host, obviously once the charging station is there, you want to know a little bit better how you should bill your customer, what would be the best way to do so. And there's different data that we can collect through our different portals, and I'll go through there the different slides afterwards to provide a little bit more insights. But obviously, those services need to be considered when you're going to install EV charging station at your location. And the last piece of the puzzle is more on the charging point operators. So really, we see the charging as mission critical. So we really want the charging station to be up and running when a driver is coming. That being said, we obviously have customer service 24/7, so we can support the EV drivers coming at a station and find the right solution for them to charge their vehicle. But the main idea is to really have a reliable charging station. So you'll need to consider as well a solution that comes with some proactive maintenance or even maintenance once it's done, and just have this up and running the more often you can, just so that the utilization rate makes sense and that you attract those EV drivers either to your properties, to your retail location, and so on. So as I mentioned, I'm an application engineer, so that would really be my role within Flow. That's a department we've just created recently because we want to help you navigate those steps and make the right decision, just so that the EV drivers, when they park, they can have the best charging experience. So in terms of support, obviously I'm just part of a broader team. So at Flow we have broader teams from coast to coast and local support with partnerships with contractors, suppliers, distributors, etc. But speaking more about my role, and as hinted by Matt, the questions we could discuss are really on the deployment themselves. So where should I put the charging station? Is it better to put them at the entrance, or should I prepare some bollards, some additional infrastructure, just so that the EV driver, when they park, they can just go to the charging station seamlessly and start their charging station? So that's a few points that we try to bring when we discuss with a potential customer, just based on the experience and the past deployment we've done. One critical aspect is really on the energy management. I'll go through it a little bit in the next slides, but obviously every project is different. And if you're looking at deploying those charging stations at existing sites, well, the question you'll need to ask yourself is whether or not it's possible. So that's one of the aspects on the electrical infrastructure that needs a little bit more thinking. But again, once you get to understand better the solution, it's not that complicated, but we're happy to support you guys in those steps. So if I'm going more into the hardware themselves, so the charging station. So here is a snapshot of our Core Plus product. So this is really, as hinted on the slide, a good application for any multi-residential buildings, workplace location. So I would say those are semi-private, accessible location. So the reason why it's a great fit for those applications is that it comes with energy management features that I'll go a little bit deeper in the coming slides. But in addition to that, all our charging stations can come with different configurations. So you have a little bit of an overview of how it could be mounted. So obviously every site is different. So you might have access to a wall nearby. You might be indoor. You might be outdoor. You might need a pedestal. So that's the few options that come with the charging station. One important feature is obviously the cable management system you can see. Depending on the deployment, you do not want to have those cables laying on the ground. Without cable management system, obviously the EV drivers, they can manage the cables. So you can see just next to the connectors, there's a hook where they could just put the cable back once the charging station is done. But what we've seen is with the cable management system, since it's retractable automatically, this just allows for a cleaner installation. So that's one of the features we try to highlight and see if it could make sense on your deployment. Last, and just going back to this notion of getting a high uptime and really a reliable product. So when we design those stations, we try to have the materials that can withstand the Canadian harsh environment, so the -40 to +40, the snow, the salt. So that's why we're going with aluminum casing. So that's also some points that you want to double check before deploying a charging station. What's the material used? And obviously, if it's a rack design, you'll have a higher uptime and just EV drivers that are going to be able to connect anytime to a charging station. So that's really the goal there. And a few other aspects that are highlighted here is really around the networked functions. So those stations, they are connected to our backend for the purpose of authentication, billing, usage data. So this will come with some communication requirements, which we can also discuss with you for your deployments. And last but not least, obviously, as Matt mentioned, to access the charging station, you can go through the app, so with the networked aspect, or with the RFID card. So that's the different solutions we've provided for this specific charging station. So as I highlighted before, so the car plus come with a few energy management solutions. And the reasoning behind is really this long session time. So the person being plugged for 4, 8, 10 hours, and those short commute. So usually drivers would do max 40 to 50 kilometers a day. And if they're plugged for 10 hours, 8 hours, or even 4 hours, they might just need 2 hours of this time at full power. So what we came up with is this notion of power sharing, which you have the example on the slide, where the power can be dynamically allocated between up to 3 or 4 vehicles, with the charging station just sharing the same circuit. So for you, in terms of deployments, you're gonna avoid a lot of cost having multiple wires. You can share this circuit and have virtually up to 3 times or 4 times more charging station deployed for the same electrical infrastructure. So that's something we really see a lot of interest for those workplace application or those multi-residential units. Obviously, if you were to install it public or on the go, the drivers, they really expect to get the lot of the most power output. So you have to be careful when to use this station and when to use another one, or where to use these feeders, because there's a lot of communication that goes around it. Billing as well would need to be taken into consideration. So that's the discussion we could have, and just to keep in mind, so that when the driver comes, obviously they could be a little bit upset if they just get like half or 1/3. But if you see in the example, obviously when a car is fully charged, then the next car is going to take the full power available. So it's really dynamic. And that could be a great way to save on some cost on the deployment. In terms of more the operational cost, we have a features that's called the power limiting. So you have an example here. So if you already know that, for example, the power output has some strain at a specific time of the day, you could schedule to have a power limit at some of those times, just to avoid going into those peak charges, because then it could cost a lot for your facility just paying those peak charges because you haven't planned beforehand. So having these features just allows you to navigate a little bit better and get a less of a high cost in terms of the operation of it. And finally, the last point I would highlight is the daisy chaining capabilities, or the cascading setup, what we refer to. And it's basically leveraging the power sharing capabilities of our charging station and already planning for future deployment. So knowing that your charging station can share power, you can already plan some conduits and use the same wiring to come and install maybe 2 years from now one other station, maybe 4 years from now another one, and then having those set up in power sharing with very limited new costs when you come down the line 2 years from the start of your projects, just avoiding trenches, additional electric work. So that's another features we try to highlight and see if it makes sense for your project. So more on the public-facing charging station. So this is the Smart 2, and maybe to your point, this goes with the patented locking mechanism. So to give you an example, it had great success with some of our customers deploying those publicly, because you cannot access the connector until you go and start a session. So that's just an extra layer of protection in case there would be anyone that wants to try something with the connectors or the charging station themselves. But overall, the same ideas in the design are present than with the Car Plus. So you have a very rugged design, aluminum casing, so it's weatherproof, weather resistant, and it's also a level 2 charging station. One thing I would highlight is maybe on the different configuration that are available. So one great success we've had with this charging station in existing facilities is just mounting it on existing poles. And the reasoning behind is really to reduce the footprint, because that could be a little bit tricky for some existing projects. So that's a way we've kind of found a solution just to avoid having another pole, another infrastructure in your urban environment, and that's pretty straightforward to do. I don't know exactly for your type of projects if you were to be like in a retail development, but for existing facilities moving on to LED, for example, in certain lampposts, that just free up some capacity. So you can kind of start thinking about also including some EV charging in your project. So that's also a way to look at it. And finally, last but not least, so this is our smart DC product. So to make a distinction with the level 2 charging station, this is a level 3 charging station. So we're not charging with AC, we're going up to DC. Obviously, the charging speeds are going to be higher. Here you got an example for 50 kilowatt or 100 kilowatt in terms of range. It's going to be faster, but it's going to require a little bit more works on the electrical infrastructure. Obviously, not every facility have the right existing electrical infrastructure, or you might not need to have such a power coming to your facility. So this is always something that needs to be thought carefully. As I said, if the car is parked long enough, maybe level 2 is enough. If you're looking at a rest stop, gas station, or maybe some of your retail location where you know your customers are not going to be staying longer than an hour, maybe 30 minutes, then that could be a good selling point for you, just bringing those customers in, having a fast charge while they do other things in the retail nearby or in your facilities. Obviously, again, the features are rather similar in terms of design. So we're using something very rugged, the aluminum casing. And for level 3, even more than level 2, you really want your charging station to be up and running and to be proactive in how you manage it, just so that it's always used and that you can leverage the full value of having it on your property. So that's one of the aspects we try to highlight. And one of the I would say like the takeaways that we found is really having a product that is easy to maintain and service. So that's also something we've worked on, so that when it's maintained or serviced, then it's up and running in no time. So that would be it for the hardware side. As I discussed a little earlier, there's everything happening in the back, more on the e-mobility services that you can provide. So when choosing a charging station, you want also to maybe look at how you will be able to leverage to the fullest this charging station. And for the drivers, is how are they going to find it, or are they going to interact with it, or are they going to use it? So having a networked station and connected is really the best way to have this for this leveraging strategy. So for the owners as well, for the station owner, they will need to access the data, and there's different ways for them to look at what's happening on their sites and just eventually optimize the future deployment. So that's the few aspects we try also to bring to the table, so that when we're discussing EV charging station deployment, there's an informed decision that's been made. So this is just a quick snapshot of what it could look like. So I think you see on the top the smart view. So it's everything around the usage, the reports that you can have. Some company or some owners might be interested in knowing how much emissions they're going to replace with those stations. And they want also to use those data to kind of advertise for some of their approach towards sustainability and their goals. So that's a great tool to just do so. The other aspect, obviously, as I highlighted a few times, is all around the utilization, whether or not a lot of EV drivers are coming to a station, how long do they stay. So that's some data that could be quite useful. The other side of things, so on the operation themselves, having those network stations will allow you also to get those updates in terms of firmware, software. So obviously, all those players in the EV industry, they're just updating their products as new cars roll down. We always test and make sure that every car can plug. So having those network capabilities will just let you keep your station up to date. And finally, something I may not have mentioned that much, but on the e-mobility services, you may want to look also at what network can your driver access if they go with this specific charging station. So obviously, Flow, we have built quite a network in Canada and the US, so you may be able to leverage already your existing account for this specific station and go and drive around. So there's different interoperability agreement as well in the industry, which allows different vendors, different type of networks to work together so that the drivers can charge seamlessly anywhere he wants. So that's a point you want to maybe confirm before deploy the charging station. On the operation and maintenance, so here's just a quick snapshot of the few aspects that could be of interest. So everything around the proactive monitoring. So having those data, those usage, we may be able already to find something that's going wrong. So we'll act proactively just to ensure that your station will be always up and running. As I said, the network updates is one part of it. The smart view that I just described is accessing all those data. And so you have another few examples on how we try to manage our fleet of charging stations. So we're there to support the charging station's owner with their deployment and ensuring that their drivers can always park and charge at their station. So that's always something you want to check when you go and look for a possible charging solution. Just how much support can you get, and just ensuring along the way that the operation of those charging stations will be smooth. And maybe speaking more about the investment and how you could gain back this money that you could have put in your charging stations. So obviously this comes at a cost, but from what we've seen, every deployment is different, so it's difficult to really put a number on the value you'll get from the revenue. One part is obviously the selling the services, so accessing the service station and paying for the charge is one way to recollect some of the revenue. But as we described a little earlier, there's some intangible or difficult to estimate, let's say, value. So for example, having those specific demographics to some of your facilities, attract those type of people to your work, to your multi-residential building. It's always great to have those drivers part of your development. Sorry, and so finally, being part of the Flow network also allows you to kind of bring this brand image and link to this pool of drivers that are already using the rest of our charging stations. So you will attract even more drivers to your locations. So yeah, so that's a few points that could be of interest. But if we're looking more at the upfront costs, so here are a few, I would say, tips and tricks that we could share with you. So there's different ways of approaching those deployments. I would say that here in this case, we would recommend to developers to go and deploy those themselves, because they would be able to access some of the funding and incentives that are available. Some of those incentives, for example, are simply for a certain scale of projects. So having just one drivers or one-off deployments here and there might not be enough to leverage fully what's available from the federal and provincial governments. And obviously, this would just be offered as part of an amenity to your building, so just like a gym or the elevator, if you think about it. Another way to look at it, and maybe more specifically for the multi-residential building, is just having the dedicated person to this parking stall pay for the station. So that's also another strategy you could discuss for some of your projects. In terms of ongoing operations, so you will more likely than not have a provider that will come in for the operation, the maintenance, and all those e-mobility service we just described before. So that will need to be taken into account when you do the return on investment analysis. And you will need also, obviously, to account for the electricity that's going to be used at your charging stations. But once it's installed and once it's deployed, this will just bring value to how you can advertise certain properties, certain developments, and how you can sell those. Then EV drivers themselves will just pay for the usage. So Flow will provide different solutions for the billing, and just in partnership with the property owner will collect those fees and share them back with the developers. So that's one way to look at it. And so basically, if the building managers comes at a certain deployments, take care of the charging station, that's the few points they will have to keep in mind. So the ongoing maintenance and the proactive services that can be offered with the station. So everything that comes around the operation of the stations, and then anything that would be the actual energy costs, and the revenue management at the end of the day to recollect. So that's a quick overview of how we would recommend approaching some of those deployments. Obviously, that can be a little bit tricky for those first-time buyer or first-time, let's say, developers, but we really see it as a new must. That's where the industry is going. We see EV drivers really increasingly buying EVs, and so that would provide just a competitive advantage and some benefits to your deployments. So yes, I think I've gone through the presentation, and basically I don't know if believe we have some times for questions. If you have any specific points or specific slides that you wanted to go back to, we're happy to discuss those a little bit further. So I don't know if that's the case.
I think one more point I would add that we haven't mentioned too much is, yes, it's important to have the building ready, which are what municipalities and government are trying to do for new buildings. But there's also, it will take a long time before we have 100% of EVs on the road. It will take decades. So it's very important to look at it as a phased approach. Like, yeah, we want to support electric vehicles, but we know that in the next 5 years, maybe 5% of the vehicles will be electric. So you don't need to have all the charging infrastructure ready. You can just have just a couple of charging stations, collect the data, see what's your business model, how much revenue you generate from it, what's your cost, and then look at optimizing it that way. So that's why also Julien was mentioning the daisy chain, where you have 2-3 charging stations, but then the system is ready when you need to deploy more charging stations and scale up. As I was explaining, it's a chicken and the egg. So you put charging stations, it attracts EV drivers. Then you want to install more charging stations, more EV drivers. But then you also have constraints with regards to the energy management, and that's where you would need the software. So piece by piece, you can build the charging infrastructure.
Perfect. Well, I do have a few housekeeping items, so I'll thank you all for joining us today for this presentation. Anyway, Matt and I will stay a little longer if you have any follow-up questions and want to discuss with us, so we'll be here. I would also add that you could take a moment to complete the survey and access it by the QR code outside of the room. And there are continuing education certificates that will be emailed to you following the event. Finally, you can also attend the South Building show floors just down the escalator on level 800. I believe you know that. Yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us if you have any question on the presentation, the support. We're happy to help for your deployments. So thanks again, and wish you a great conference. So enjoy your stay here.